Hello, this is Sam Gerrans from samgerrans.com. Today is Tuesday, August 29th, 2023. And today the subject is Ouspensky, Esotericism and Modern Thought. Although I may come up with a more clickbaity title than that. Now, normally on Mondays, although I've moved to Tuesdays because I have a reduced load on YouTube, Substack, etc. because I'm busy, I have been dealing with the thought of Jacques Ellul and specifically his book, Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes. And I am going to continue with that, but I want to stop off this week and look at part of an essay by P.D. Ouspensky. And this essay is called Esotericism and Modern Thought. And the reason why I'm going to hit this part, I think it's about 6 pages I want to go through, although I may elide some parts of it, is because he, from a different angle, hits on some of the things which Ellul is talking about, but also manages to hit other points which pertain to my broader work. So that's why I'm interested in it. Ouspensky was born in 1878, died in 1947, if I'm not mistaken. He was obviously influenced to a great extent by Gurdjieff, and he's known in that context. But I think that he's somewhat overshadowed by Gurdjieff, possibly unfairly. He was a very interesting thinker in his own right. He wrote the book, a series of essays which has been compiled into this book, A New Model of the Universe, not all of which I have read, but which those parts which I have read I found very interesting. And it's one part of this that I really want to hit. Now, these essays were written in some part whilst he was under the influence of Gurdjieff, with whom he sort of parted ways. Well, he did part ways later on. And I think it's fair to say that Ouspensky's dominating thought was a journey toward the esoteric, i.e. to that reality which is implicit and not obvious in what we generally regard as reality. And I don't know that he was successful ultimately. It's a bit like a maths question where perhaps the final answer is not as important as the working out. He, toward the end of his life, I think he became disillusioned. I mean, he also lived through what are called interesting times, namely the First World War. And just to go back to these essays, many of them were written over quite a long period of time. Typically in this book, you'll find that they were written between, say, 1912 and 1929. So this is, it's an accumulated amount of thought. Eventually, I think he became tired and perhaps just was not able to get a grasp on the things that he was able to analyze intellectually. I'm not sure that he was able to kind of get hold of them in a more, let's say, visceral way. And in the end, he became an alcoholic and drank himself to death. Not much more Russian than that, I'm sure people will think. But anyway, what I'm going to do is go through some of this. It's I'm beginning on page 38 of this particular book, which is halfway through this essay. So you have to bear in mind that there's been something that's preceded this. This is as I normally say, this is a long form piece. Some part of this will be on YouTube, or perhaps about half to about 2/3 of it will be on YouTube, and all of it will be on my Substack. If and when I go away, which I probably will at some point, all of the Substack stuff will just be opened up, although not to comments, because it's paid subscribers get to comment. I can't be doing with the rest of that. Anyway, why? Because there's it's not some sort of arrogance on my part. It's just there's potentially 7 billion of everyone else, only one of me, and a lot of the people, not a lot of the people, but if you get into things like YouTube, it's not, some of them aren't even real people. And, some of the rest are, I'm not just talking about my channel, but, they're sitting in a, I don't know, in a porta cabin in the Negev desert somewhere, So it's you can't compete with it, and why bother? Anyway, let's jump into this, see how we go. To begin, but if we try to continue with this idea of successive civilizations, we shall see that every great culture of the great cycle of the whole of humanity consists of a whole series of separate cultures belonging to separate races and peoples. All these separate cultures proceed in waves. They rise, reach the point of their highest development, and fall. I would refer you to the work of Spengler, for example, who's interesting on this point, although verbose. And you kind of do need a PhD in civilization to read him, but even without that, he's worth the read. The Zakat Zapata, what's that in English? The Decline of the West, written, I think, about the same time, incidentally, about the turn of the First World War. To continue, a race or a people which has reached a very high level of culture may begin to lose its culture and gradually pass to a state of absolute barbarism. Now, I'll just say it seems to me that he uses this word barbarism advisedly, and it repeats in what continues. The savages of our time, as has been said before, may be the descendants of once highly cultured races. And this was a point of departure for me when I realized that the whole idea of evolution is, the popular idea of evolution is completely incorrect, and certainly flies in the face of what our forefathers believed. They believed that we started in the Golden Age and sort of were in a state of involution or devolution, and that we are now in the lowest possible, or the lowest so far kind of instance of civilization taken on a broad scale. And for example, the Hindus would call this the Kali Yuga, or if you go back to Daniel chapter 2, I think, where you've got the Nebuchadnezzar's dream. You've got the feet of clay and iron. So we're not progressing. This is a lie. This is part of the propaganda that I try to talk about. A whole series of these racial and national cultures taken over a very long period of time makes up what may be called a great culture, or the culture of a great cycle. The culture of a great cycle is also a wave which is made up, like every wave, of a number of smaller waves. And this culture, like the separate cultures, racial or national, rises, reaches its highest point, and finally sinks into barbarism. And as we shall see, we are currently in barbarism. And I would say, when I say we, I'm not just talking about the geographical West. Despite the new series of conceits about the fair world order, i.e. BRICS, etc., and I happen to live in one of those countries, the fact is that these countries are deteriorating too. It's nothing to do with, it's nothing to do with the politicians or anything like that. It's just that the culture, technologically and in terms of its sort of creative power, spent itself, and it's just kind of eating its own tail. But that's more obvious in the West, where you have, quite psychotically delusional women and, the whole thing. I mean, just as an example of this, just one example, I recently came across the fact that I'm not a fan of it, but women's football, the Spanish won the women's football, and the manager of the team, in a moment of exuberance, kissed I think that she was the captain of the team that won, his own team. And now they're turning this into some mea culpa and another kind of reason to destroy the culture. You're finished. And this isn't a value judgment. It's just understanding the topology of cultures. Any culture which has got to this point of delusion and men dressed as women, women dressed as men, abusing children into becoming, the opposite sex, supposedly, etc. It's finished. It's done. It's got nowhere else to go. To continue, of course, the division of periods of barbarism and periods of culture must not be understood literally. Culture may entirely disappear on one continent and be partly preserved in another, which holds no communication with the first. I would take issue with this holds no communication thing, because I think if you go back to the pre-deluge times, certainly the different parts of the world clearly was in communication with each other. We may think in precisely this way in our own culture, as times of indubitable, profound barbarism in Europe may have been times of a certain culture in parts of Central or South America, perhaps in some countries in Africa, Asia and Polynesia. The possibility of a culture being preserved in some parts of the world in a period of general decadence does not affect the main principle that culture proceeds in great waves, separated by long periods of more or less complete barbarism. And again, I would argue that we are in a period of barbarism now. We're in the new Dark Ages. And it is very possible that periods occur, particularly if they coincide with geological cataclysms, with changes in the state of the Earth's crust, when every semblance of culture disappears, and the remnants of all the earlier humanity starts a new culture from the beginning, from the Stone Age. And just to pause there, in Ouspensky's thought, and he's certainly not alone in this, you'll find that what is presented to us as sort of beginning, a Stone Age, was just simply a culture that, or parts of a civilization, which was just all that was left. Can you imagine what would happen to our so-called civilization if electricity went away? Like tomorrow. We'd be completely finished, because we don't have the skills which a pre-electrical civilization had. We're totally ignorant. If you took away the iPhone or the mobile telephone from these sort of modern monks you see walking around who can't take their eyes off a screen, how long do you think they would survive? Only the strongest physically strongest and most aggressive would potentially survive in what you might call, Stone Age environments, and perhaps could build some sort of civilizational culture, or at least a sense of traditions whereby hunting and killing would allow them to survive. All that to say that the idea that men came from Stone Age man is kind of built into the waft and web of this whole idea of evolution, which is in itself would have been anathema to the majority of our forebears, and I would argue is a form of propaganda designed to make human beings feel small and also complacent and arrogant at the same time. It's a very clever piece of PR. To continue, according to the idea of esotericism, not all the valuable things gained by humanity during the periods of culture are lost in periods of barbarism. The main substance of what has been gained by humanity in a period of culture is preserved in esoteric centers during a period of barbarism, and afterwards serves for the beginning of a new culture. Just stop there. If you read de Lubitsch, for example, and I think Anthony West has a book which develops upon his ideas, and he wasn't alone in this. I think Ouspensky would probably concur. If we take, for example, the ancient Egyptian culture, it arrived fully formed from somewhere. This doesn't fit into this sort of evolutionary conceit of modern culture. And when you think about evolution, when you really kind of sit down and think about it, it's essentially flattering the lowest common denominator, which is what democracy inherently does. It's the idea that the whole of history was conspiring to ascend the slippery slopes, and has just now reached the pinnacle and managed to realize its infinite potential in you. Yes, somebody who thinks about nothing except just gutting more stuff and going shopping. It's amazing, isn't it? Every culture rises and falls. The reason is that in every culture, as we can observe, for example, in our own, completely opposed principles, the principle of barbarism and the principle of civilization, are developed and evolved at the same time. Just will say on the point of evolved, this was written in Russian, and this is English translation. I would say that his use of the word evolution, at the very least, does not presuppose that the modern conceits that we've been alluding to. The beginning of culture comes from the inner circle of humanity, and often it comes by means that are violent. I'm going to skip a bit. In our culture, it is very easy to trace these two lines, the lines of civilization and the line of barbarism. The savage killed his enemy with a club. Cultured man has at his disposal every sort of technical appliance, explosives of terrible power, electricity, aeroplanes, submarines, poisonous gases, and so on. So this essay was written between 1912 and 1929. All these means and contrivances for destruction and extermination are nothing but evolved forms of the club, and they differ from it only in the power of their action. The culture of the means of destruction and the culture of the means and methods of violence are the culture of barbarism. Stop there. I don't entirely agree with him on this, and the reason is because previously there was a culture of the noble warrior and of the knight, and an entire esotericism attached to that. That is gone. War today is simply an expression, not simply, but largely, it requires bravery, but really what it is primarily is an expression of technique, of industrial output and logistics and management. It's very little to do, or much less to do, with individual valor and bravery. I'm not saying valor and bravery are irrelevant, but what I am saying is it doesn't matter how much valor and bravery you have, if you don't have the technical machine to feed that, then that's to no effect. Also, I would say that previously the role of knight was of a higher order. Now the kind of armies that we see are essentially plebeian. I'm not criticizing soldiers, I'm just saying the nature of war has been intrinsically affected by the character of technique. To continue, further, an essential part of our culture consists in slavery and in all possible forms of violence in the name of the state, in the name of religion, in the name of ideas, in the name of morals, in the name of everything imaginable. The inner life of modern society, its tastes and interests, are also full of barbarous traits. Passion for shows and amusements, passion for competitions, sport, gambling, great suggestibility, a propensity to submit to all kinds of influences. This is really why I'm reading this. To panic, to fear, to suspicions. All these are features of barbarism. And I would say that by barbarism, what he's really talking about is the effect, if not the cause, of technique, which is what Ilul is talking about. And they all flourish in our life, making use of all the means and contrivances of technical culture. This is his word, technical culture, such as printing, telegraph, wireless telegraphy, quick means of communication, and so on. So the very latest that this was published, yes, 1929. So he would have been alive at the same time as writers such as René Guénon, and I'm sure they must have read each other. To continue. Culture strives to establish a boundary between itself and barbarism. Now, when he's talking about culture, he's talking about actual culture, not what you think of as culture, because you're living in a barbaric culture, a barbaric pseudo-culture. Also, the manifestations of barbarism are called crimes, but existing criminology is insufficient to isolate barbarism. It is insufficient because the idea of crime in existing criminology is artificial. For what is called crime is really an infringement of quote-unquote existing laws, whereas laws are very often a manifestation of barbarism and violence. So what he's really talking about is the creation of the state as a tyranny, and a barbaric one at that. Such are the prohibiting laws of different kinds which abound in modern life. The number of these laws is constantly growing in all countries. 1929. It's constantly growing in all countries, and owing to this, what is called crime is very often not a crime at all, for it contains no element of violence. It's a victimless crime. I mean, in America and the West now, you can't move. You can't move. In Canada, you can't collect rainwater. On the other hand, unquestionable crimes escape the field of vision of criminology, either because they have not the recognized form of crime, or because they surpass a certain scale. I just stop there. I mean, if you look at the kind of crimes people like Joe Biden and the people above him commit, they're off the charts, but they're never ever going to be held accountable, of course. Well, not in this life. In existing criminology, there are concepts: a criminal man, a criminal profession, a criminal society, a criminal sect, a criminal caste, and a criminal tribe. But there is no concept of a criminal state, or a criminal government, or criminal legislation. Consequently, what is often regarded as a quote-unquote political activity is in fact a criminal activity. This limitation of the field of vision of criminology, together with the absence of exact and permanent definition of the concept of crime, is one of the chief characteristics of our culture. And he's talking about our culture in the sense of a Western culture. And I would say that Western culture is the only culture, because the only cultures that will survive are those which embrace Western culture, and Western culture is essentially technique. The culture of barbarism grows simultaneously with the culture of civilization, but the important point is that the two cannot develop on parallel lines indefinitely. The moment must inevitably arrive when the culture of barbarism arrests the development of civilization and gradually, or perhaps very swiftly, destroys it. In fact, he says completely destroys it. It may be asked why barbarism, I'll just hit this point again, when he's talking about barbarism, this is very close to what Elul is talking about in terms of technique. Why barbarism must inevitably destroy civilization, why civilization cannot destroy barbarism. And this is a question that I've been asked in various forms a number of times. It is easy to answer this question. First of all, such a thing has never been known to happen in all the history we know, whereas the opposite phenomenon, that is the destruction of civilization by barbarism, the victory of barbarism over civilization, has occurred continually and is occurring now. And has been, as has been mentioned before, we may judge of the fate of a great wave of culture by the fate of the smaller waves of culture of individual races and peoples. And I can't remember whether he says this in what I'm going to read you or not, but what he basically means is that what he says is that in order for civilization, by civilization what he's really talking about is esoteric knowledge, to survive and be developed requires effort, whereas involution and destruction is you can do that in neutral. It doesn't require any. It doesn't require the same order of effort, and so things tend to atrophy, right? So that's what happens, and that's what we see around us, especially given our pseudo culture and pseudo civilization. I'm going to skip a bit. It is quite possible that in separate cases of small or even fairly large but isolated cultures, civilization temporarily conquered barbarism. But in other cultures existing at the same time, it was barbarism that overcame civilization, and in time it invaded and overcame the civilization of those separate cultures, which in their own countries had overcome barbarism. I'm going to stop there. And I would argue that technique, the technique of which Ilul talks, is really the barbarism which has overcome whatever existed of cultures, actual cultures previously. Whether we're talking about, and I'm not talking about brand Islam here, but actual Islamic culture, the culture of the Persian Empire, the actual culture of the Brahmins, and the caste system, and the Hinduistic religions of India, the Confucianism of China, actual Christianity, and certainly esoteric Christianity in Europe, have been all crushed into powder, into dust, by this materialistic philosophy. So what he's talking about in sort of a localized form, I would say, is what's happened, is happening, has happened across the world. The second reason for the victory of barbarism over civilization, which can always be seen, lies in the fact that the original forms of civilization cultivated certain forms of barbarism for the protection of their own existence, for their own defense, their own isolation. Just going to stop there. I'll give you an example. The samurais of Japan, the fact that when the Americans turned up in Japan, first of all, to start selling whatever it was, the Japanese came out with gunboats and said, we're going to blow you out of the water unless you go away. So you had a samurai caste, you had a warrior caste that I mentioned before, but that's not what you see in soldiers today. It's actually just really, they're more of a manifestation of industrialization. To continue, such as the organization of military force, an army, the encouragement of military technique and military psychology, the encouragement and legislation of various forms of slavery, the codification of barbarous customs, and so on. These forms of barbarism soon outgrow civilization. Very soon they begin to see the aim of their existence in themselves. There's an important bit coming up. Their strength lies in the fact that they can exist by themselves without help from the outside. I'll just stop here. If you read Guénon, and perhaps more particularly Evola, Julius Evola, they both talk about the involution of the castes, and what happened is that each of the such as it were lower castes began to usurp the one above, and thinking that it would be possible to arrogate to itself power. But what it actually did was undermine the foundation upon which it was built. And what you have now in the world is a system whereby the lowest possible common denominator, the total pleb, I'm not saying this to be rude, it's just a fact, is now the unit of policy, at least on a sort of exoteric basis. And that's why you have the cult of popularity, the cult of number. The more subscribers, the greater, more attention, all of this stuff. Quality is elided from the debate. Nobody cares about quality anymore. Everybody gets a gold medal. To continue, civilization, on the contrary, having come from outside, can only exist and develop by receiving help. That is, the help of the esoteric circle, i.e. of quality men who understand truth. But we don't care about those men anymore. We're not interested. I believe that they existed, perhaps still exist, unrecognized, minor enclaves in places. But they would be very stupid, I think, to announce themselves or to try to share what they know, because quantity man is too stupid. Perhaps put another way, is lacking in the perceptors, the receptors to engage with that kind of knowledge. To continue, but the evolving forms of barbarism very soon cut off civilization from its source, and then civilization, losing confidence in the reason for its separate existence, begins to serve the developed forms of barbarism in the belief that here lies its aim and destiny. And this is what the world culture is doing. And that's why in my view, it's done. All the rest of it's just, as people like to say, just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. All forms created by civilization undergo a process of change and adapt themselves to the new order of things. That is to say, become subservient to barbarism. Theocratic government is transformed into despotism. Castes, if they have been recognized, become hereditary. Religion, taking the form of quote-unquote church, becomes an instrument in the hands of despotism or hereditary castes. Science transformed into technique. This is the word he uses, same word as Ilul. Transformed into technique subserves the aims of destruction and extermination. Art degenerates and becomes a means for keeping the masses on the level of imbecility. I mean, look around you. Anyway, I'm going to stop there for YouTube and all of that. So let's wrap that bit up and we'll continue on Substack. Details of where I upload to, how you can join my Substack and Telegram channel, support my work and download my books free are in the description. Thanks for listening and bye for now.